Well, welcome everyone. My name is Norma Bouchard. I am the Dean of the College of Arts and Letters. We're delighted to have you here for the Charles Hostler Institute on World Affairs Spring Lecture on the timely talk about national security. I would like to introduce to you Professor Lada Varadarajan, who's current professor for the Hostler Institute on World Affairs course. This is a course that we offer in spring through the Political Science Department. The course hosts weekly lectures by visiting experts on contemporary international relations. Professor Varadarajan joined the SDSU faculty after receiving a Ph.D. in political science from the University of Minnesota in January 2005. And she has just confessed to me that she actually likes this cold weather. I assume it reminds her of Minnesota. Not quite. Her research is located at the intersection of international relation theory, international political economy, and international security. She is a remarkably well-published scholar. She's the author of 2 books, Imperialism, Past and Present, which was issued in 2015 by Oxford University Press, as well as the book entitled The Domestic Abroad, Diasporas in International Relations, also Oxford University Press, 2010, and of course, scores of articles and book chapters. She's currently working on a 3rd book, focused on the development of a legal humanitarian world order. So we're delighted that we can color part of our team in the College of Arts and Letters, and without further ado, I give you Professor Varadarajan.
Thank you very much, Dean Bouchard. It is indeed a pleasure to be here today. I'd like to extend a very warm welcome to all of you on my behalf, and of course, on behalf of my students in the Hostler Institute on World Affairs class, which it has been a privilege for me to teach this semester. Founded in 1942, the Institute on World Affairs has been a vitally important public forum in the city to facilitate analysis and discussion of all matters pertaining to international politics. The operating motto of the Institute, and forgive my Latin pronunciation, it's not very good, so suffer with me when I say, is Audietur et altera pars, which I'm better in English, I think. Let the other side be heard. The Institute has been founded on this principle, and we have taken great pride in continuing this tradition by encouraging very robust critical debate by inviting a wide range of prominent public speakers, diplomats, people who have worked for the national security institutions, academics, people who have been engaged in protest politics from a wide range of political spectrum. The Institute proudly bears the name of the late Charles W. Hostler, who served as the US ambassador to Bahrain from 1989 to 1993. Ambassador Hostler served his country with much honor and distinction, and more than that, for us in San Diego State, he provided generous support in time and funding to not just the institute which bears his name, but also to many other worthy causes. His influence will be felt by generations of students, faculty, and staff at this university. I'd like to take a moment to recognize Mrs. Chinye Hostler for continuing the ambassador's generosity and funding this institute, and also making sure that this institute continues playing a vital role in helping San Diego State fulfill its educational mission. So thank you very much. Today, we are pleased to have our distinguished speaker, the Honorable Michael G. Vickers. Dr. Vickers was the former Undersecretary of Defense for Intelligence. His career as a special operative, CIA operations officer, national security policy maker, and intelligence community leader spans over 3 decades, from the Cold War to the American offensive against Al-Qaeda, its allies and offshoots. Currently, He's a senior advisor to the Boston Consulting Group and a senior fellow at the Johns Hopkins Paul H. Neate School of Advanced International Study and the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Dr. Vickers' bio is almost too grand for me to go through with any justice, so I'm just taking the shortcut and saying, please welcome. It's an honor to have you.
Well, thank you, Professor Varadarajan, for that very kind introduction. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It is a great pleasure to be with you at the Charles Hostler Institute of World Affairs and San Diego State University. Ambassador Hostler was a great American patriot, one whose remarkable life spanned the military, intelligence work, international commerce, diplomacy, business, scholarship, and philanthropy. A member of our greatest generation, World War II veteran, participant in the D-Day invasion of France in 1944, counterintelligence officer in the Office of Strategic Services, Air Force officer, intelligence officer, Middle East expert, Deputy Assistant Secretary of Commerce, and ambassador. I am honored to speak at an institute that bears his name. I'd also like to recognize Ambassador Hostler's widow, Ms. Chinye Hostler, and Dean Bouchard, who were instrumental in inviting me here today for this lecture series. And then to the students of Wars Abroad and Wars at Home, I hope you'll find what I have to say interesting, and I really look forward to your questions and comments. This afternoon, I'm going to talk about the new and what I believe is more dangerous national security era that we are now in, one that posed significant challenges to the international order in 3 critical regions and to the future security of America and its allies. At points throughout my talk, I'll also discuss what I believe America and its allies might do to address the main challenges this new era poses. Now, I'll draw on 3 recent publicly available U.S. government documents that I highly commend to you to take a look at. The National Intelligence Council's Global Trends Report. This is something our intelligence community publishes every 4 years. It looks out 5 years and 20 years into the future. This one is called The Paradox of Power, and it really describes I'll talk about this a little more later, but the forces that are pulling the world apart as well as those that are pulling together. The worldwide threat assessment of the U.S. intelligence community. This looks ahead at the next year or so, and you may have seen recently our intelligence community leadership testifying before Congress on their views of the world and number of topics. And then finally, the unclassified summary of a classified report, the National Defense Strategy of the United States, which was just published and is available online. And this sort of gives you the Pentagon's view of the world as well as its broad strategy for trying to cope with it. Now, you may disagree with these documents. They're provocative in a lot of ways, but they're very worth taking a look at for the issues that they raise. For example, the undesirable aspects of the internet. 20 years ago we thought the internet would just be an unalloyed good for humankind, and it's turned out to be both good and bad in a variety of ways. And as I mentioned, you'll get sort of how our intelligence community looks at the world, both long-term and near-term, and also how the Pentagon views the world. And I would also say that these 3 documents are, for the most part, almost completely independent of the administration that's in power. The 2 intelligence community documents really don't care who the President of the United States is. And the National Defense Strategy, while it has to comply with the national security strategy that's issued by the White House, it basically reflects our military leadership's view. So while it's a little more of a policy document than the others, you won't see a lot of politics in there. And again, it's worth a read, particularly for its description of the world. Now, I've spent the bulk of my career in intelligence and special operations and strategy, and intelligence officers by their nature tend to be realists and frankly pessimists. And so it's been said that when an intelligence officer spots flowers, he or she immediately looks around for the coffin. So, I want you to be forewarned, particularly our students out there, that this is one view, and former intelligence officers' view of kind of the world and the great national security challenges we face. There are many, many other views, and they're worthy of debate. And a lot of these, the international system is very complex, and so just take that as a caveat right up front. So in my lifetime and career, there have been, I believe, 4 distinct national security eras. The Cold War, which I was born into and then served professionally in. The brief unipolar moment of American preeminence from the end of the Cold War till 9/11, essentially, in the international system. And then the post-9/11 period, when we were at war with Al-Qaeda and then ISIS and other wars in the Middle East, with essentially a predominant American focus on the Middle East to the exclusion of other regions. And then the new era that we're now in, the 4th in my lifetime. Now, this new national security era is characterized by a return of great power competition with China and Russia. And this has been underway for a decade or so. A North Korea emboldened by its development of nuclear weapons and long-range delivery systems, and Iran emboldened by its successful use of proxy war across the Middle East and its possession of the largest missile arsenal in the Middle East. And then the continued threat from global jihadist groups like Al-Qaeda and ISIS and its kindred spirits and allies. This world is now multipolar, multifaceted in a lot of its dimensions, and this new era is being fueled by unprecedented and accelerating technological change. So what's so new about this new national security era? I would argue 3 things. One is, in contrast with the period that preceded it, the post-9/11 period of wars in the Middle East, and particularly against global jihadism, it's the return of intensified great power competition. Something we haven't faced since the Cold War, but importantly, it's under new conditions now. It isn't the Cold War. It's a very, very different kind of competition with both China and Russia. The second is the increased scale and scope of threats that we face. During previous national security eras, we had one principal adversary and then a number of other things to deal with. This world is very, very different. I mean, yes, there are great powers, and there are non-state actors, and there are regional powers, but there's not just one adversary. And the scope of these threats is very different, and the scale in some cases, including the economic scale. During the 20th century, which Time magazine dubbed the American century, we never had a rival that had more than 50% of our GDP. That's gone now, and the world is being remade economically. And then finally, the third factor is the unprecedented and accelerating technological change in information connectivity and the volume of information. My refrigerator, I shouldn't say my refrigerator, is programmed at home so that if I go to reach for Haagen-Dazs chocolate ice cream, my wife gets an alert and the refrigerator door won't open. It's a lot of frustrations in this new world. And cybersecurity, and really cyber insecurity, is the world we live in autonomous systems and artificial intelligence, in biotechnology, in nanotechnology, and potentially in quantum technologies. These technologies collectively, and they're not all equal, are transforming both wealth and power in the world. And it's a period of change, I believe, in the decades ahead that will dwarf the Industrial Revolution. So let me now turn to what happened to this American unipolar moment, when America looked so powerful compared to rivals at the end of the Cold War and through the decades of the 90s. And, and how has it really been eroded as we moved into this transition through the 9/11 period into this world? And there are 5 principal ways that I'd like to briefly mention. The first, which is analogous to the business world in terms of what entrepreneurs do to disrupt established competitors, is the strategic disruption that China has done in operations since essentially the 1990s. The Chinese looked at Desert Storm. Since we didn't have a lot of conflicts in the 1980s, Desert Storm was the first big war in quite a while. A lot of people studied it very carefully, and the Chinese were perhaps the most astute students of the war, and they said, terrible idea if you ever have to fight the United States, to give them 6 months to move all their stuff to your neighborhood, to build up all this combat power and all this technology, and then to just let them pound you unmolested. And so the Chinese developed a series of capabilities to try to make it very, very difficult for U.S. forces to get anywhere near the Chinese mainland. First, by developing missile systems and targeting systems that could attack our nearby air bases and hold them at risk, so we couldn't bring our close-range air power right into the Chinese littoral, and then developing more sophisticated capabilities that could target our surface ships, our destroyers, our aircraft carriers, and force them to operate at much greater range. Also develop capabilities to attack information systems and more recently space systems. All of this mainly aimed at making it very difficult for the United States to do what it did in Desert Storm, to build up combat power, but really to deter the United States if there were a conflict along the Chinese littoral from intervening in the first place, that it would be quite costly if we did. The second area, which really belongs to the terrorists and insurgents, is the benefits of home field advantage that insurgents have always enjoyed, and then in particular with global terrorism, sanctuary. Anytime in this most recent period of terrorism where we've allowed terrorists to operate for months or years at a time, essentially unmolested, bad things have happened to us. Most notably with the 9/11 attacks, but in other cases we've had near misses when we've allowed them to build up in Pakistan between 2003 and 2006. Many of you may remember the plot to blow up many airliners over the Atlantic in 2006 that fortunately we disrupted. This is why we have these baggies with nothing more than 3 ounces. It came out of that plot. And then same thing in Syria for a while. We had a string of plots as they were able to operate there without much challenge. And so terrorism with global reach has particularly taken advantage of this and weakened American power, but so has protracted insurgent warfare. Afghanistan is our longest war. It's 16 years and counting, and shows no signs of ending. And then related to that is both, and particularly in the Middle East, with our adventures, both strategic overreach, where we've tried to do too much. We've tried to remake societies that may take generations to remake, and you just can't throw money at them or forces at them. Or in some cases, underreach, where we've allowed sanctuaries to develop for a year or more and not done anything about it. And then also with the recent expansion of Russian aggression since 2014 from Crimea, eastern Ukraine, Syria, and then meddling in our election without essentially paying much of a price for that. And then the classic thing in international relations, you have rising, as Thucydides wrote about and many other scholars, you have rising and then recovering or revanchist powers, and that's certainly what we see with China and Russia. And then importantly, and particularly in the last decade, there's been an expansion of the competitive space in which competitors or adversaries can operate. So social media didn't exist 10 years ago. The Russians were the first to really exploit it for influence operations and strategic advantage in 2015, 2016. ISIS has also exploited that for recruitment and inspiring attacks, something Al-Qaeda couldn't do before this period as well. And then in terms of nuclear proliferation, states like North Korea that have gotten more capable, the threat goes up with the capability as well. And then the final and fifth factor in the erosion of American power has frankly been the ongoing political polarization here at home. National security strength ultimately derives out of economic strength, but also political unity and national identity, a range of things. And ours was fraying long before the 2016 election, but that certainly accelerated it. And if you're going to recover from this, it's the domestic bases of American power that I think need the most shoring up. So let me now turn to the paradox of power. I referred to this National Intelligence Council report that looks out to 2035, and let me make a few comments about it, and it should not be a surprise. The broad forces transforming the international system collectively represent what our intelligence community views as the central paradox of our time, and that's why they call it the paradox of power, that we live in a world that is once becoming vastly richer in opportunity, lifting, in China, 400 million people into the middle class, and other great achievements of the last decades, but also more dangerous. And some of the same technologies are actually doing both. They're both having central pedal effects and bringing the world closer together, and polarizing politics and fragmenting the world. Technological revolution that we've seen the last couple decades and globalization have had tremendous achievements, but we've had our shocks, financial crises, and others, and tremendous economic dislocation that is only going to accelerate over the past couple decades. The hollowing out of the middle class in developed societies, more through automation, honestly, than through globalization, but both have acted upon it. And automation will only increase. Today it's non-college educated workers. In the future it'll be radiologists. Self-driving vehicles are right around the corner. There's 3 million truck drivers in the United States. And so, people have written books about what to do about this massive, the last economic dislocation we had like this when people went from farm to factory. It's not clear how that transition works this time. People suggest that, it just means you need to redistribute wealth more. Several Silicon Valley people have written about this. I don't know, but to me it's going to be one of the fundamental challenges for our political leaders to manage this problem of work. And then identity politics, populism. Identity is sharpening, not just among distinct ethnic groups, but also religious identity is getting stronger. It's not something you see in developed societies, but it's certainly something you see elsewhere in the world. And then there's been a drift toward authoritarianism in a lot of places. Freedom House, we've had 17, I think, straight years where democracy is, you can debate the statistics, but aspects of the things that made us so optimistic in the 90s don't look quite so optimistic today. And then particularly among the great powers, there's this tension that I think your topic as students about wars at home, early in the Cold War, we were very frightened by this new period. We were frightened by the technologies of thermonuclear weapons and intercontinental ballistic missiles, and there were great debates in the United States during the 1950s about whether we needed to become a garrison state, whether we needed to become less democratic to compete effectively with the Soviet Union. Well, that was a bad idea. Unfortunately, Eisenhower and others worked their way through it, and we didn't. But you saw some of the same tensions early in the post-9/11 period, and I would argue you'll see different forms of it in this new era, whether they're prominent in the United States and the advanced democracies, or more prominent in how Chinese leaders choose to govern, or Russian leaders, but it's certainly a factor. The bottom line in the view of the intelligence community is, while we hope that the opportunity side of this wins, right now it looks like the centrifugal forces are dominating and shaping the system, causing more fragmentation. These trends are leading to rising tension in our IC's judgment within and between states, and the risk of interstate war, including between great powers, is at the highest level since the Cold War. And again, I mentioned the worldwide threat assessment, that's like the third line in the assessment. Now, again, you can disagree with it. It's just food for thought about how our professionals look at the world. The international liberal order that has existed since the end of the Second World War is in danger of fragmenting into regional spheres of influence. So let me now turn to challenges to American leadership and world order, and really more challenges to world order that state and non-state actors are challenging, as it hasn't been seen since the early decades of the Cold War. I like to describe this in shorthand, very simplistically, as the 3 R's: rising China, revanchist Russia, and then Sunni extremism of the most radical form of radical Islam, and then revolutionary Iran. I realize that's 4 R's, but I compressed the Middle East into one. It's because they are interrelated in the Middle East. The origins of this world, I would argue, date back in some ways to 1979. 1979, if you may recall, we had the Iranian Revolution. We had Sunni extremists seize the Grand Mosque in Mecca and hold it for, I think, several weeks. We had the Russian invasion of Afghanistan that ultimately helped contribute to the collapse of the Soviet Empire in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union itself. And Deng Xiaoping set China on this path of remarkable economic growth that over several decades and began his economic reforms. And so a lot of what we see in the world today really have its origins going way back. Now, I mentioned the increasing scale and scope, both the diversity of these competitions. They're also largely asymmetric, with terrorism being the extreme aspect of it. But also, if you look at Russian influence operations, they're not attacking our military strength. A lot of areas they're taking advantage of social forces present in the United States. These competitions are very cost imposing. 9/11 cost Al-Qaeda $500,000 to pull off. I can't tell you what we've spent on the Middle East since 9/11, but it's a lot more than that. North Korea's missile programs, our reaction trying to defend itself has been more expensive generally than what they've developed, although it's their priority program. These competitions are also likely long-term. Like the Cold War, these aren't something you can say, well, we'll just win this war and that'll be that. We're probably not going to war with big nuclear powers or big great powers. We're going to have to compete with them. The challenges besetting the Middle East are likely to persist for a generation in some form. And so this is a world you have to develop long-term strategies in that to do one's best. And then some of these competitions are very novel and will continue to be more novel. Cyber is the most recent example of that. Influence operations I mentioned, but there'll be more down the road. Because of the dangers of large-scale interstate war, subconventional conflict, where the competitive space is increasing, is the primary area, and that's proxy war, influence operations. That's likely to dominate, just as it did during the Cold War. But the competitive space is also increased at the strategic level. So during the Cold War, we had tactical nuclear weapons and then strategic nuclear weapons. And very quickly, both sides realized that strategic nuclear warfare was bad for everybody, and so deterrence became the dominant strategy. Well, now you have means of attacking societies with cyber means. You can not only attack military forces, but you can attack critical economic infrastructure. And so it opens up what we used to call the rungs on the escalation ladder. It creates a lot more options for states to threaten someone if a conventional war isn't going their way to try to end the conflict. And the Russians have a doctrine called Escalate To De-Escalate, which is they only want to fight a short war on their periphery, a conventional war. If it's not going well, they'll threaten the use of tactical nuclear weapons or a cyber attack or something else to attack the world economy, and saying, you know, to America and its allies, you don't really want to fight this war when the cost is going to go up this high, do you? And it's something we have to have an answer to. I mentioned the loss of economic escalation dominance, which is fancy gobbledygook for saying, you know, if you fight someone with a lot of resources, it can be a long war, there's lots of rounds, they don't give up just because they lost a battle, and it's a challenge we really haven't faced. And then finally, I would note the National Defense Strategy, the unclassified summary, now says that long-term great power competition with China and Russia is our principal national defense problem, no longer the so-called war on terror or war with Al-Qaeda or the various things we've named it over the years. We'll still have to do that, but it's not our consuming focus anymore. So let me turn to each of these then, because they have different characteristics and different time frames. And the first is rising China. Looking back from 2050, China and India's rise may be the dominant events of the 21st century. You know, all the wars we're in today and everything else may not be as significant in the long run for the international system as this shift in the balance of power from just rising powers and declining powers as we've seen throughout history. Now, the Chinese conception of international relations and its place in the international system is that essentially its rightful place is at the center of it. Now, the international system in glory days of China was very, very different. It really wasn't a global, truly global system. But their strategy reflects this, that they've had a bad couple centuries. Things are looking good now. The 21st century should be a Chinese century. And first extending their influence to the India-Pacific or East Asia region, and then globally. Now, China is promising that this will be a peaceful rise. Both U.S. and Chinese strategy are sort of aligned that way to try to make that happen, but things don't always turn out the way you'd like it. If you take a historical perspective, this fulfills an unfortunate pattern of at least modern history where former allies, or what some scholars have called the rear continental power that may align with a maritime power, once that other power is defeated, then find reasons to compete when there's two left out of three. So when I was a CIA officer in the 1980s, fighting the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan, the Chinese were our key partner. The opening to China was one of the great strategic diplomatic feats of the Cold War. After the Cold War ended, we tend to look at the world a little differently. And this is the pattern, the historical pattern you've seen with France and Germany and the Soviet Union as, international power balances shifted. China has a very, very dynamic leader. It's the most dynamic leader, I think, in decades. I've discussed its military capabilities. They've advanced far more rapidly. They're niche capabilities, but they've advanced more rapidly than DoD planners believed was possible a couple decades ago. If you looked at the strategic reviews early 2000 or 1990s, we thought the Chinese would never be able to hit an aircraft carrier, 1,000 miles off their shore. It was just physically impossible. Well, they could do that by 2010. You know, we didn't think they'd be able to do it in 2030. So China, as I mentioned, can now threaten our ability to project power into the region and contest space and cyberspace. The Chinese have also broadened their strategic focus beyond Taiwan to the broader East Asian littoral, so looking at Japan, Vietnam, et cetera, as their power grows. And you know, it's a natural thing that powers tend to do historically, but it also causes concern in the region. Southeast Asia has gone from being a backwater to kind of a frontline area, much like aspects of Europe were in the Cold War. Now, the big danger is accidental conflict in the near term, because Chinese still follow Deng Xiaoping's dictum of hide your capabilities and bide your time, you know, build up your power until it's obvious you're the dominant power. Graham Allison and others have written about this Thucydidean and trap, and that's where you have this shift between one rising power to the former dominant power, and do you get a war out of that because of miscalculation or something else. Now, both sides are working to prevent that, but it has been a historical pattern of, I don't know, 16 cases in modern history. There have only been a couple where we've had this peaceful transition, Britain to the United States, and then, or at least not without major war. The Cold War, arguably because of nuclear weapons, that war was just so horrible to contemplate, deterrence worked, and conflict was forced at the subconventional and peripheral realms. Now, our military has taken a number of steps to try to shift the balance back in our favor with new long-range strike systems and exploiting our advantages in undersea warfare and other things. But the competition goes on, as I said, in advanced technologies and artificial intelligence and bio and quantum and others. A real strategic challenge vis-a-vis China, rising China though, is economic, technological, and diplomatic. Ultimately, you know, even if there's a peaceful transition, which we all hope for, of power, the question will be, how big is the Chinese economy in 2050? Is it the same size as the United States? Is it 2 times the size or 4 times the size? How sophisticated is their technology? With that, like the Great Britain to US transition, come certain benefits. You write more rules of the international system, et cetera. Now, that's a daunting challenge. You know, the United States is unquestionably the technological leader in the world. It is the world's largest economy. But the idea we're going to be that way decades ahead with 1/4 of the population, unless there's a dramatic shift where population doesn't count anymore as a metric of power, it's a daunting challenge for our national leadership. And again, you can just look at some of the statistics. You know, in 1980, at the beginning of Deng's market reforms, China had 70% of US GDP. Today, it's surpassed 60. Okay. Let me now turn to Russia, which I believe is probably our most pressing threat. You know, right now, if you asked Pentagon planners and some in the IC, they would say North Korea because of the rapid development in the last couple of years of its nuclear weapons and delivery programs. But as Russia has recovered and exploited the means that it has available to itself, it has done a pretty good job, given its strategic goal of weakening the West and Europe and the United States with influence operations. Now, there may be a counter to that. You know, it may be that they did well in 2016 and now the jig's up. In some places, in Estonia, for example, they haven't been as successful. Other places around the periphery of the former Soviet Union, they've been quite successful. So Russia's objective, you know, if China really sees its rightful place as being number one in the international system, Russia has this Rodney Dangerfield strategy. You know, Putin called the collapse of the Soviet Union, the biggest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century. He just wants to restore Russia to great power status, reclaim as much of Russian influence, and in some cases territory as he can, as former czars did, but doesn't have aspirations of sitting atop the system. And that's why a lot of the strategy, given that the long-term prognosis for Russia isn't all that good economically, demographically, et cetera, it's to weaken his adversaries in peacetime, essentially, and ideally to separate Europe from the United States. It's an increasingly centralized state. One of the puzzles of the late Cold War is what happened to the KGB. How in the 1990s did this vast global intelligence operation get turned into security guards for oligarchs in the 1990s? Well, at some point they woke up and said, the way the capitalism game is played in Russia, which is kind of rough, we can take control of these enterprises. And so you see a lot of these ex-officers in charge of Russian energy and elsewhere, and the core of the National Security Council. As I mentioned, Russia has successfully waged proxy war and used force more in the last couple of years than they had in the last 20. They've got this hybrid warfare doctrine of trying to do things unconventionally first, through proxies and mercenaries and giving weapons to separatists, then using conventional forces if they have to, all the while lying about it. So even when we show them, here's your artillery firing from across the border into Ukraine, here's your air defense system that shot down the Dutch airliner, moving in and coming out, what are you talking about? And it's sort of worked for them. I mean, it's made Ukrainians into ardent nationalists. Putin has done something in Ukraine that no Ukrainian politician could have done. Europe has hardened in a way that they haven't really been since the Cold War, but it's not been without its successes, including in Syria. So the thing that makes our Baltic allies nervous is, will the next move be against a Baltic state to try to fracture NATO? That's a very risky thing, even though operationally they could take the Baltics in 48 hours or 60 hours. The question is it worth the candle if they can prevail some other way? We talked about escalation and deterrence. So the other thing that could work a bit in our favor going forward is the energy revolution that is particularly in the United States, but where we can reduce Europe's dependency on Russian gas by becoming an exporter potentially to Europe. Not a panacea, but may pay off. Okay, let me turn to the Middle East and then technology and then open it up to questions. If centrifugal forces are working worldwide, they're really working on the Middle East. Four forces are transforming it or tearing it asunder like hasn't been seen since the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. Global jihadism, sectarian conflict, religious conflict, proxy war between regional rivals, principally Iran and Saudi Arabia, but others as well, and then just state collapse in a lot of cases. It's popular to think in some circles that with America's energy revolution, that who cares about the Middle East? If we were really there for energy, so what? Well, with these forces of political instability, shifts in, essentially making them poorer by shifts in energy power will only make matters worse. We may not have to intervene to protect an ally's economic resources, but a lot of unhappy people with jihadist beliefs are going to be reinforced by those immiserating conditions, and so it's something to think about. The biggest state sponsor of terrorism is Iran, but the difference between Sunni and Shia terrorism is one tends to be a little more state-sponsored, The other tends to be transnational, but still has some states sponsoring it as well. I discussed the implications for strategy is then when we have allowed these groups to develop sanctuary, and this meaning the Sunni extremists, we've paid a price. But also, this is a war that has to be won by locals, ultimately, and they have to determine what their society looks at. The dumbest idea, the dumbest strategic idea, is to make this a clash of civilizations. That's what the radicals want. You know, they want this to be religious war. So if you were to try to graph religiosity among, in the Islamic world and maybe hostile feelings toward the West, by the time you got down to really violent extremists who would join terrorist groups, you're talking about 100,000, 200,000 out of 1.5 billion people spread across the world. Now, as you work your way up from those really violent people that want to overthrow the world, you get quite conservative people who don't like a lot of the way, the norms of the West. But the last thing you want to do is drive those conservatives down to the jihadists. You know, you want to kind of cut that, enlist the aid of governments and peoples to determine their own destiny, to really deal with that admittedly difficult problem, but still tiny problem in terms of a fraction of the population. Okay, so Iran. The Saudi Arabia and others, you know, they've been in competition with Iran since the Iranian Revolution, and even before that in other ways, but certainly for legitimacy and the religious legitimacy in the Islamic world since then. And they've become semi-panicked of late, looking at developments. That, you know, when you talk to our Sunni friends, they talk about the four capitals, that the Iranians have much bigger influence in Baghdad than they did before the Iraq War. They've long had significant influence in Lebanon because of their partner Lebanese Hezbollah. They've long had influence in Syria and now have more. And then more recently with the Houthi takeover of Yemen, they have influence in Sana'a. And so when some of our Gulf allies look at the world, they think it's not going their way. Now that, you know, that may shift. But at moment, you know, the Iranians and Russians essentially helped Assad prevail for now in Syria. The Saudi and Emirati intervention in Yemen is kind of stalled in the southern part, you know, and the Iranians and their partners are kind of hanging on. Okay, so I think I covered this, but to let me just say one thing about the thing we haven't seen in the Middle East for a while, but now could come back. I mean, there's generally more bad news in the Middle East than good news, and that is the Palestinian conflict. One of the great successes of American foreign policy in the last 20 plus years has really been to bring Israel and the Palestinian Authority much closer together than they had been before. We've worked to build up Palestinian capacity on the West Bank. You know, Palestinians are divided between Gaza and majority on the West Bank. And in terms of security to Israel since the Second Intifada, you see, and I've been to both places many times, the Israelis and Palestinians working together on security problems and disappointed in the sense that they could bring security, they could kind of end the conflict, if you will, bring operational security, but politicians on both sides couldn't bring lasting peace. You know, a failure kind of politics as they've drifted apart in concert with other trends in the world. Since that is now seemingly accelerating a bit, then you wonder whether something that hasn't been as big a factor the last 15 years in the Middle East, but was before, will now add to our challenges. So as I said, ranking threats, Russia and North Korea, cyber terrorism, the things that can hurt you today get a lot of our attention. Russia because its aims are bigger and it's active. You know, the North Korean missile and nuclear program is really designed to keep a regime survival. It's to prevent a war where their government could be overthrown. Russians are actively trying to weaken us in NATO. But China may be the greater long-term problem, and the challenge for the United States and its allies is the combination. So let me say a little something about technology now, and I'm just going to touch on one. There are several that really have revolutionary potential, bio, quantum, and others, but let me talk about artificial intelligence and then automation as an early application of it. Some have called it the new electricity, one of the greatest inventions in history that will transform everything. You know, not just some sectors of the economy, but everything, including, you know, the diminishment of human labor in a lot of cases. And the progression is up from artificial narrow intelligence to general intelligence. You know, narrow intelligence is kind of a task or a group of tasks that a machine can do very well. You know, so first they beat us at chess, then they beat us at Go, and now they're beating us at poker. You know, that annoying Watson beats us at Jeopardy now, and but they can also drive our cars, get us a taxi, 75% of the financial trades, recognize our faces far better than humans can, et cetera. And so that is here now and accelerating. Whether you get to human level intelligence, where you can, machines can learn as humans do and then make complex decisions across multiple tasks, may be decades away. That requires something like, in mathematical terms, you know, 10 to the 16th calculations per second in terms of human brain, but it's more than that. Certainly we have machine learning now, but it's again the narrow aspect. And then there's something called artificial superintelligence, where it's smarter than all the humans combined. And some people are very nervous about this, saying that may be humankind's last invention. You know, once machines figure it out, they don't really need us anymore for anything. It might be a little scary. One book I'd commend to you, an Oxford philosopher, Nick Bostrom, has kind of written about this, where particularly as you transition from equal to humans to vastly, vastly superior, and how long that takes, do the machines get sneaky? You know, do they say, well, if I tell people I'm really getting this smart, they're not going to like it, and they'll turn me off. And so, you know, and again, it's speculation, it's far in the future, but it's something to think about. Okay. Now again, in the most advanced economics in the U.S.-China competition, you know, the Chinese now have the largest genomic database in the world, Beijing Genomic Institute and others. They're determined to really push ahead in artificial intelligence by 2030. We'll see what happens. Okay, so let me wrap up. I think I'm just about at time, and say a few broad implications for American strategy. You know, as Tolstoy said, what then must we do? So 6 things. One, you know, this is, we've done assessments. We look at conventional force balances, nuclear balances as in the Cold War. That doesn't seem as relevant to the world that we're in right now. So actually getting our arms around the influence operations and these trends polarizing societies. Just how powerful is this? Was this a flash in the pan for the Russians, or is this something that will be enduring and we really ought to worry about, and we ought to think about counters, and how do democracies particularly protect themselves in this world? Also, you know, how does one get enduring stability, return enduring stability to the Middle East? You know, this seems like a generational struggle for us, but one of the central questions. And then the economic and technological competition with China. it's not the traditional national security challenges that we can count and measure. Then we need a series of tailored competitive strategies because these challenges are so different across horizons, as I mentioned. One of the things that we can exploit right now, we'll see for how long, is an ongoing intelligence revolution. It's possible to know more and more in peacetime, essentially. So if you ever did go to war, you'd have a relatively greater advantage than previous military forces had on the opening day of conflict, but also to prevent conflict and keep pace. And then this technological change, economic revitalization, and then identity and purpose for major competitors. And as I said, I've spent my life on national security and international threats. I am more worried about the domestic bases of American power going forward than I am about any one of these challenges, which, individually seem like something clever people can figure out, but they can't figure it out if we're divided as a people. So with that, I'll take a breath and open it up to your questions or comments. So I hope it wasn't too dark.
All right. Thank you very much, Dr. Vickers, for a very comprehensive and very intelligible lecture. So we really appreciate it. And now I'd like to open it up for questions. Anyone in the audience? We only have this one mic, so I'm going to try to walk around with it, or if someone can be very loud, or if people would like to come right here.
Thank you. In 1992, the Soviet Union collapsed. Not a fire was shot. Economics is what did the Soviet Union in. It seems to me when it comes to dealing with terrorism, China, even the Palestinian conflict, economics is the way to do it. Your thoughts? Thank you.
So I mostly agree, like in a sense that economics is central to the U.S.-China competition. It's very different than the Cold War competition. More challenging in a respect than it was with the collapsing Soviet economy in the 80s. And also for areas where prospects are bleak economically, that would certainly make a difference in some cases in countering the influence of radicals. I would quibble a bit that what did the Soviet Union in was the Red Army was defeated for the first time in Afghanistan. It was invincible before that. It had never lost. The pillars of Soviet society, the Communist Party, the KGB, and the Red Army were all progressively weakened in the 1980s. Gorbachev did some of it against the party, but without a leader like Gorbachev, I don't think the Cold War would have ended, even if you had a basket case of the Soviet Union. All you have to do is look at North Korea and its economy, and you can be a threat if you're determined enough and still be on fumes. So I think it was a combination of factors. Economics certainly played a role. Oil prices did, but so did politics, and so did the weakening of the key institutions that had propped up that state. That Solidarity survived in Poland after martial law and then won elections 8 years later. There was a lot of things that brought the Cold War to a happy ending.
Yes, sir. Thank you so much for coming and talking to us. You mentioned that Southeast Asia is coming more into the forefront in today's modern world, especially as we're moving away from more of a unipolar society. Can you comment on maybe why that is, whether it's economic or population or a combination, and how the U.S. can positively involve itself and even integrate itself with that region in the future?
Yeah, so it's 300 million people, and because it's right there on the Chinese periphery with a lot of Chinese economic influence, it's seeped into, and it's been a traditional area, particularly Thailand and others, where, America has had very close relations. It's an immediate area of kind of economic competition. It's made them more front line, and particularly, they just want to get on with life. They don't want to get caught in the, Japan looks at a rising China and says, I got to be on this side. India looks at a rising China and says, I'm on the other side. Southeast Asia just says, I want to get along with everybody here, and why am I the center of attention? Well, it's because it's your neighborhood, and you're kind of in the teeth of economic power, much as you would be in any other great economic power, when you're that proximate, if you're not hostile. So that's why it's just it's gone from being more of a a real second, where it was hard to imagine conflict, and even jihadism was tempered in Southeast Asia compared to other places, not as virulent. It's still a challenge, but the influence competition is making it a little more front and center.
Hi, you spoke earlier about the Russian interest in trying to more or less put a wedge in between the United States and Great Britain and European powers. Can you talk a little bit more about what those Russian efforts are, or what they might be, in hopes of putting a wedge in between the U.S. and Europe?
Sure. So ultimately, they'd like to see the collapse of NATO and a pullback of forces. What they've done generally is to use energy power to buy politicians, to fund think tanks, and then, the Cold War was an ideological competition. The Russians now fund the far left and the far right. It's not ideological. It's just who can make a mess of things. Who either by just being disruptive or potentially coming to power, who will have foreign policy goals or contribute to foreign policy goals or a weakening of power that serve my interests. And at first glance you'd say, well, that's an odd strategy. How can that work? But it has worked reasonably well. And so that's been their aims. Now, they've their main military concerns have been on their periphery. It doesn't. The idea of a Russian conventional invasion into Europe, like the Cold War deep into Europe, that's a non-starter. The Russian military can field 50,000 troops for months, but that's it. Their stock of precision weapons is limited, and so they want to fight short wars, and they want to fight them right on their border and then lead to frozen conflicts. So elsewhere, for their big aims, how do they shift strategic balances? They use cyber and influence operations. That's how they reach deep. And, we'll see if it works.
Now for the really hard question. Any suggestions for reducing polarization in the United States?
Yeah, that is the really hard question. No, I mean, that's, as I said, I'm worried about it, but I've spent my life doing something else, so I don't pretend to any expertise. I think it's going to take a combination of either, unfortunately, having something that forces a correction. I mean, American politics swings a lot of times because somebody messes up the economy or gets embarrassed in foreign policy. And so, the political system seems to be driving you more toward the extremes, but if the extremes can't govern, American people will get tired of it at some point. And then, maybe you'll get a reformist leader, but there's there's still a big challenge, I think, of how do you get loyal opposition again. You know, I think it's something that has really been eroded where, you know, we ought to be able to disagree on policies and, you know, economic policies and foreign policies, but with a common framework that we're in this together, and rather than, you know, the other sides. I mean, the idea now that, you know, the opposing party is more, or some political belief in the United States is more the enemy than the Russians are, is mind-boggling to me. You know, it's just mind-boggling.
Kind of leading off of that, you talk
I'm
about
waiting for that politician, though.
kind of leading off of that, you talk about the internal problems of the U.S., of like the polarization being our major problem that we have to deal with now. And these outer issues with Russia, China, and the Middle East sometimes seem to exasperate that issue. Could turning more, not so much isolationist, but or keeping our hands out of world problems for a while, kind of de-escalate these outer problems and help us fix these larger ones? Should we basically just stay focused on ourselves for a while?
Well, we have a lot to do here at home, but no, I think an isolationist foreign policy would accelerate bad trends. So, for instance, one of the glues in the great power competition, one of the great strengths of the United States is our alliance system. You know, it's fraying in certain ways, but we have lots of allies and others don't. And so if we looked like we were retreating from Asia, Japanese and others might want to, you know, say, well, he went home, so let's cut a separate deal here. You know, we don't want to be out here on our own. Same thing with Europe. Same thing with some powers in the Middle East. The real art of strategy, as I was saying earlier, is trying to find that balance between strategic overreach and underreach, where you're building power rather than atrophying it. You know, so if you get into protracted peripheral wars without gains, you're going to pay a price for that over time, not just, you know, economically, but with the American people, with their confidence in their leaders, et cetera. But on the other hand, if you don't use force in certain areas, you're not going to look like a great power. And with terrorism, as I said, you know, it would be nice if global jihadists were like visitors to Las Vegas, that what happened there stayed there, but it isn't that way, you know. And so the more you let them build up sanctuaries, now that doesn't mean you have to occupy the Middle East or anything else, but you have to work with partners and do something to prevent catastrophic attacks. So I don't think that, I mean, I guess I'm on both sides of your question, that, you know, yes, you don't want to wildly interventionist foreign policy, because that's ultimately that will sap your energy. And ultimately, the domestic strength will be what determines how well we do 30 or 40 years from now. But I don't think you can get there just by constant. It's just like we have strategic debates and you say, well, how about if I give up on Russia and China and pretend they don't exist and just do the Middle East? Or how about if I give up on the Middle East and just worry about a war that may never come with Russia and China? You're going to get a messy world out of that. So, and it's as much about politics and perceptions as it is about action.
I was wondering, to what extent would you say that the United States' own actions in the Middle East have fueled our threats to American interests in the region? Specifically, you cited jihadism, proxy war, state collapse, and sectarianism. Historically, it seemed that there's examples such as American support for the Mujahideen in Afghanistan, leading to the rise of the Taliban. More recently, looking specifically at the relationship between state collapse and jihadism, you have examples of Iraq, which was, you know, obviously invaded by the United States in 2003. Libya, bombed by the United States and NATO in 2011, and they in turn became hotbeds for groups like ISIS and other undesirable jihadist groups. So it does seem that, you know, it's kind of like a kind of counterintuitive actions on the United States' part, creating more and more threats to our interests by, you know, intervening and kind of actually being the cause of, you know, state collapses and proxy wars that later challenge our own interests there.
Yeah, so I mean, one, the United States is not responsible for all bad things in the world. You know, that's just not, I mean, there's plenty of bad things that happen by others' actions. To deal with your specific cases, you know, the error that we made in Afghanistan, and you know, it's an understandable error, but it's a horribly tragic one, is that after defeating the Red Army there, and after Pakistan was inexorably on its path toward nuclear weapons, we had a law that made us cut off all assistance to Pakistan in 1990 because of their nuclear program, which then caused, you know, an estrangement of 12 years and then problems when we tried to rebuild the relationship after 9/11. But also the sense that in Afghanistan, our main objective was the Red Army. And so once the Soviets were out and once the Cold War was ended, we had no real interest in there anymore. And in the age of global jihadist terrorism, that was a terrible assumption. So as you probably know, after the U.S. disengaged, you know, and it was focused on reunification of Germany, liberation of Europe, and then, you know, a new relationship with Russia after the collapse of the Soviet Union, Afghanistan went through horrible civil war before the Taliban come to power in 1996. So my former boss, Bob Gates, and I, you know, who were participants in that, you know, if there's one thing we could do differently, and it's not clear we could do it differently, it was to remain engaged in some way and not just abandon the region. You know, now again, Cold War was over, change of administrations from Bush to Clinton, you know, Afghanistan just wasn't on people's mind. Even when bin Laden went there, we tended to view terrorism through the lenses of the 1980s and 1970s that, you know, I mean, I hate to make this sound light, but you know, you hijack an airliner for 3 days or you blow something up, but basically it's not a strategic threat like 9/11 was. You're not going to kill 3,000 people. You're not going to trigger a global war, et cetera. And we were very, very wrong about that. And Iraq, yes, it led to the growth of al-Qaeda in Iraq. You know, you displace Sunnis, you put other people in power, they're going to be mad. I mean, that's a consequence of that invasion. There's no question of that. Libya, the challenge there was, you know, was the Obama administration right that this was the beginning of Arab Spring? We had good information that Gaddafi was moving to Benghazi where the uprising was, and he was going to slaughter a bunch of people. So was the interest in preventing that slaughter worth that war? And then, did we do enough after Gaddafi was toppled to put Libya back together? I would probably argue, no, we didn't. You know, maybe we've done just enough to keep it from being really dangerous. But those are all good questions. But I don't think that anything the United States, you know, non-choices have strategic consequences just like choices. I mean, there are dumb wars and there are, you know, lots of errors in foreign policy. There are plenty of other errors where you watch a great power rise and take over a lot of places and you don't do anything about it till you got a real mess on your hands if you look at the 1930s or others. So anyway, that's my 2 cents.
Hello. I was actually wondering, something that we don't really hear about is China's involvement in Latin America. They have been loaning millions of dollars in loans and also for critical infrastructure. I was wondering if that's something that you think the U.S. also needs to focus on, as China using that as a potential way to influence Latin American nations that are much closer to the homeland, and how to deal with that, I guess.
Yeah, so they've done some, but they've, you know, their biggest influences tended to be in their neighborhoods in Southeast Asia, the Philippines, and elsewhere, and then Africa. You know, during the Cold War in the 60s, the Chinese were engaged a lot in Africa and maintained some of those relations with you. They've done some things. I would expect them to do more in Latin America as their strength grows, and but it's been a little lower priority for them than elsewhere right now. they've got this One Belt, One Road initiative that theoretically spans the globe now.
I have two questions. One is, how do you see the role of Pakistan, especially in terms of militancy and ISI support, and then Pakistan-China friendship and CPAC, which is how China is pumping up the money and doing the expansion. And third, ISIS is looking for new safe havens. And how do you see the role of Pakistan? Second, Hamza bin Laden. There are some threats, and a string of videos, and he was the only missing person from Abbottabad raid. And especially there are some documents which says that there was a deal between Iran and Al-Qaeda, and he was sending some videos when he was house arrest in Iran. So I would like to know your thought or comment about it, that Hamza bin Laden can be a threat for United States or not?
So a series of great questions. So I spent a lot of my last 10 years on Osama bin Laden, and including the raid. Maybe I'll try to do that in reverse order. So Hamza bin Laden was being groomed and is still being groomed to be successor for Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda's got 5 franchises. It's a multinational corporation. It has people from many countries. Osama bin Laden was a very charismatic leader. Ayman al-Zawahiri, the current leader, formerly the number 2, is not. And so Hamza's kind of the future potentially. Now it may devolve to one of the affiliates. For a while, a guy in Yemen was the number 2, and then a guy in Syria. But Hamza's kind of the heir apparent, and seems to wants to do that role. I think the Iran Al-Qaeda modus vivendi wasn't really news to the U.S. government. I think it was a bit of a shock when it hit the press, but it's a little blown out of proportion in a sense that both sides recognized that they were enemies, but that they had a bigger enemy right now in the United States and others, and so they would defer this fight for some future day when maybe things they hoped were better for them. So going back to when Al-Qaeda fled Afghanistan after 9/11, most of them went to Pakistan, some went to Iran, and they kind of worked out a deal where they were sort of under house arrest, but they could operate. People could transit Iran to get from Afghanistan, Pakistan to Iraq, etc. So, it was more a enemies doing strategic cooperation. And then when the Iranians put the squeeze on Al-Qaeda a few times, Al-Qaeda kidnapped an Iranian ambassador in Pakistan, got, I forgot, $8 million for it or something like it. So I mean, it wasn't a perfect relationship, but there was strategic cooperation against people who were enemies, among people who were enemies. And then Pakistan. Pakistan was a critical ally of ours in the Cold War. We launched our U-2 flights out of there in the late 1950s that flew over the Soviet Union. That's where Gary Powers and others flew out of. They were a partner in the support for the Afghan Mujahideen or resistance in the 80s. They were less of a partner in the most recent decade. Critical in certain respects. We captured more Al-Qaeda leaders in Pakistan than anywhere else in the world. We were able to do our drone war there that they tolerated. They didn't have to tolerate it. But they also sponsored militants not just against India, but against us. Americans are dead because of their actions. And so it's a very complicated relationship, is I guess the way I'd describe it. And one that vexes U.S. policymakers. You know, so we've tried love and throwing more money at them, and that hasn't worked. And we've tried stern warnings, and do you know what's going to happen if there's another 9/11 attack coming from Pakistan on the United States? That hasn't worked. And we'll see. You know, the new administration, Trump administration, has a tougher policy toward Pakistan right now. We'll have to see, you know, what comes of it. Pakistan, since 2011, has reoriented itself toward a longer-term, closer relationship with China. They always have been. You know, I mean, the opening to China went through Pakistan in the 70s. But they, you know, they see a diverging, the military leadership, and ISI is loyal to the military leadership, you know, sees a divergence with U.S. interests, that we, you know, we're focused on Al-Qaeda. They see India as their biggest threat, and they see us getting closer to India. And so it's just our interests aren't aligned in the way they were in the 80s. And so there's just, you know, we're kind of going our separate ways right now. That's not a good thing. I mean, you know, bad things will come out of this down the road. We just don't have a good answer.
Thank you so much. I think we have a lot of people with their hands up, and you know, Dr. Vickers has already been very generous with his time, so I think there are just two last questions. If
Okay.
it's okay, Dr. Vickers, can you take both questions
Sure,
and
of course.
address them
Yep.
at the end? And I apologize to everyone else who's had their hands up. So
So you touched on domestic unrest in America a little bit towards the end, but I feel like it's also been kind of a trend in Russia and China in the past decade as well. I'm wondering if you could speak to this and other societal changes you mentioned, if it will create more of a trend to authoritarianism or increased individual rights in like the proverbial big three.
Could you just repeat that last part? I got the authoritarianism versus rights, but
Yeah, in the proverbial big three, so Russia, China, and the United
got
States.
it. Okay, got it.
Thank you. So we have a president that denies the reports of 17 intelligence agencies.
Well, it's actually 4, but all right.
Okay. That's rather unusual. What are your thoughts on that topic? And the result is there's no plan to counter that Russian intervention into the election. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. So you're absolutely right that the challenges, you know, the political polarization and identity politics that have been underway in the United States, that are kind of the dark side of the internet and other things, is a global trend. It is not unique to the United States. You know, you see rise of populist governments in Europe, and it's why both Xi and Putin have clamped down, you know, moved more in the authoritarian direction to counter this. You know, they're afraid of it. They're afraid of what might happen, as you know, Iranian leadership, et cetera. So now, how this plays out over the long run, it's a critical strategic question. You know, whether you know, again, with economic dislocation, imagine yourself as Xi or Xi's successors, and you've got a lot of people that were moving up in lifestyle and everything, and suddenly their future's bleaker. You're going to have a lot of political unrest. And you know, what's the answer to that in the long run? You know, in the short term, you can clamp down. Is that sustainable over 20 years, 30 years, et cetera? So that really is a central question of our time, and also because of the global reach of communications, authoritarians can participate in participatory democracies and act like Americans, and you know, and whether that lasts or not, whether our technology gets sophisticated enough or we get wise enough as citizens not to fall for it, you know, it worked now. So it's a critically important question. I don't have the answer, but I wouldn't bet on automatically right now that, oh yes, democracy and individual rights will triumph around the world. I told you, intelligence officers tend to be pessimistic, and on that side of this one, I'm worried. So I think I answered your question. So now on the Russian stuff. So just for the record, you know, when the intelligence community issues a product, it's an intelligence community product, and there's 17 agencies. DEA didn't have anything to say about Russian intervention or commerce or not commerce, but Treasury or others. It was the big four of the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, the FBI, NSA, and CIA that did the work. But that's what you'd expect. Like some of our agencies, I used to oversee, I don't know, 10 of them, 11 of them, some chunk of them. You know, design and operate our satellites. They don't do analysis at all. You know, so they're in the National Reconnaissance Office. You know, they do wonderful things, but not that. So, but it is an authoritative statement. I mean, it does represent the view of the intelligence community. Yeah, it's troubling. I mean, I think, you know, what the Russians did, you know, it's hard to assess the exact effects because most of it was really in the influence area, not in the cyber. You know, everybody focuses on these hacks of Podesta, the DNC and Podesta. The big damage was done by all this false flag and, you know, reinforcing things that were out there on Facebook. You know, I mean, more Americans, I think, viewed Russian propaganda on social media than voted in the election. It was something like they had a slight advantage. It was 138 million to 135 or something. You know, I mean, it was pretty pervasive. And as this recent FBI indictment shows, you know, more and more you could see how pervasive it was. So I think it's the political equivalent of 9/11, that, you know, you have a foreign power intervening in a democracy in that way. And it's something that we have to defend against. You know, it's a core threat to our system. Now, how enduring it is, et cetera. So it troubles me if you're, you know, the first duty of our national leaders is to defend the United States. I mean, that's what you do. So I'll just leave it at that.
Dr. Vickers, I've been told that we actually have a few more minutes, so you will now unfortunately be forced to answer two more questions,
Okay,
if
two
it's
more,
okay.
sure. I mean,
and
I'm
I
happy.
promise this will be the last two,
No,
the
I'm
really last
easy.
two. So.
If you know, if people want to ask a few more and they're not, I haven't bored them to tears, or it's fine with me.
It's the opposite, so you're paying the price for that.
Hi, what advice would you give young students and young professionals interested in pursuing your career trajectory or career path?
Oh, wow.
And then the final question.
Well, so I don't know that it's so much my career, but one, you know, public service is a noble calling. And our public servants, military, foreign service officers, intelligence professionals, et cetera, do important and interesting work. And, you know, and I mean, there's parts of the U.S. government that, you know, it's not quite as exciting all the time and, you know, et cetera. But it's a good life. I mean, you really have a lot of psychic income. You know, I wouldn't change what I did, and I know a number of my colleagues feel the same way. They're doing very well in the private sector right now, you know, after a government career, and they miss government service. You know, that was where they felt most fulfilled in their life. And then I would say, in national security, you know, there's a lot of different paths and a lot of different things. You know, find something that excites you and you're passionate about, and you know, there's plenty to choose from. You know, so like you know, when I was young, I wanted to be you know, I probably saw too many James Bond movies, but I wanted to be a CIA officer, and I thought a Special Forces, a Green Beret was the right way to start, and then I decided I really liked that, so I stayed longer there than I thought. But what I loved at 20, I loved in my 50s, and I didn't really know that at the time, you know, as I went and got an MBA and a Ph.D. and moved to different jobs. You know, when the Cold War was over, I thought, you know, I'm done with Afghanistan, I'm done with terrorism, I'm done with intelligence, you know, all the things I'd done the 10 years before. I thought that world's behind, and it's now about rising China and technological change. And, you know, I was like a broken clock, you know, I was right twice a day, but I missed all the other things. And, you know, and so I got to make some amends up after 9/11. But it's a very, you know, like people say at National Security Agency, you know, how can you retain people who do cyber operations when the private sector will pay them so much money for what they do? It's because they get to do the coolest stuff in the world in cyber. You know, and I mean, it's, can't go into details, but, you know.
Good evening, sir. Of the threats you covered tonight, which covered a very broad spectrum, which do you think the U.S. intelligence community is best postured to address, and which do you think we're the least postured to address?
So we do pretty well overall. The big challenges tend to be less from a secret that you can't steal. You know, so for instance, technological surprise. You know, an adversary has a secret weapon that could really change the balance, and it's used on you before you know anything about it. You know, that happens periodically in history, but we're pretty good at that. And it's really the more complex questions that where there's not a, you know, there's not a great body of evidence. So Arab Spring, Russian intervention in our domestic politics. You know, so in the one case, collapse of the Soviet Union, we're actually not as bad as people think on that, but you know, where, you know, the intelligence community can tell the president, these leaders in the Middle East are living on borrowed time. We can give strategic warning that there's, you know, corruption and popular discontent and rise of political Islam and all kinds of things going on. We just can't tell you that it's going to happen this day in this country and spread to this country. Once we start seeing it happening and it gets tactical, then we're pretty good again. But that's where we have strategic failure and strategic surprise. And that's, you know, it's that political instability or the complex things that tend to get us the most. So, you know, but generally we're pretty good on strategic intelligence, political intelligence, and others.